Welcome to the Storytelling Lab, where we break down the art and science of storytelling. My name is Rain Bennett. I am your host, and I'm a filmmaker and an author on a quest to understand how we can tell better stories so that we can do better work and make the world a better place. Each episode, I host one of the world's best storytellers to help you understand how to leverage storytelling to increase your sales, deepen your connections, and serve your audiences better. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode, and I hope that you love it. Betsy, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, me too. Now, we actually have worked together before, so this is not our first time collaborating, if you will. Yeah. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. Maybe we'll get into it. I just want to jump into it immediately and ask you flat out, why on earth would you write a book after, is it 30 years of teaching? 30 years.
Well, 25 years of teaching.
Okay. Let's
yeah.
small but significant detail. After 25 years of teaching, you're retired. You're kicking back somewhere on the Pamlico River, I imagine. Why do you decide to then take on the task of writing your first book?
Well, my teaching experience is a big part of what gave me the motivation to do it. I was teaching in a program that's a very accelerated academic program. And a big part of what I did was teach my students to write at the college level, at the university level, and to research and to think about where information comes from. You know, just because somebody believes something is true doesn't make it true. And that facts are important, and researching your facts and knowing where that information comes from and how reliable it is was so important to what I tried to teach my students. And I think successfully. I think that most of my students, and I taught hundreds, I think they went on to do some pretty remarkable things. A lot of them are in research and journalism, which is interesting. And then this is also a story that has kind of haunted my husband and me. He's a criminal defense attorney. And when the story first broke, we were young parents. My children were the same age as the children in the Little Rascals Daycare. And we just couldn't let go of the story of Robin, who is the centerpiece of my book. She was young. She had a new baby at home. She could have done anything to save herself. She could have given them any information. And she refused to ever confess to anything because she insisted that nothing happened. And my husband would say to me, go ahead.
Sorry, let me jump in there too, because I don't want us to go too far ahead without let's establish kind of some foundation for the folks listening who may not know the story, right? Like, so I know the story, but let's establish that first.
Okay.
What was the story that had you and your husband in grips for so long? And I know that's a big question. We don't have to give all the details. We can do it as we go along, but explain to the people listening what happened, when it happened, and why it was so gripping to you personally.
Okay. Well, there was a hysteria, a contagion that just swept across the country starting in 1982 with a fairly unknown daycare scandal that the owners were accused of sexually abusing some of the little children. But it burst open in 1983 with the McMartin preschool case, which many of the listeners may remember. It was the longest and most expensive trial in U.S. history, U.S. criminal justice history. And the owners and the owner, the operator, who was the daughter of the owner, the grandson of the owner, and several teachers were accused of sexually molesting over 400 children. And many of those children hadn't been at that daycare in 10 years. So the Raymond Buckley, who was the first one accused, the first one charged, he would have been a very, very young, not even an adolescent when the first cases broke. But anyway, it exploded and created a cottage industry across this country, and there were 200 over 200 little daycare cases, daycares involved in these sexual abuse cases, and it was satanic sexual abuse, the great fear, the great devil fear, and parents were hysterical and paranoid and motivated by fear and by contagion, and these cases swept across the country. Barely a state was saved from the contagion, and it ended up in 1988 and early 1989 in Edenton, North Carolina. No one would have ever thought, but the Little Rascals Daycare, the owner's husband was accused by a mother. Actually, two mothers were involved in it, and a dispatch officer from the Edenton Police Department who considered herself an expert in satanic sexual abuse. They accused him of abuse against one child, and then that child eventually, under pressure, named his buddies at the daycare. Now, these children were 3 and 4 years old. They were in fact, the first child was only 2.5. And they named their friends, and then that friend, after weeks of intense interrogation, would name another child and then another child, and it was reminiscent of the Salem witch trial.
Right. Yeah.
Into the book a lot, and in my teaching, I taught The Crucible by Arthur Miller, and so I was passionate about the whole the hysterical attachment to lies and the unwillingness to consider that anything else was possible, or that people were innocent.
And you're right. This was a sweeping hysteria across the country, because I'm familiar with, and there's probably been many documentaries, but one of the most notable, it was around 96, was Paradise Lost. I think it's on HBO. Okay, so you're familiar with that one, right? Which had 3 parts of the kids. I forget where they were from, but the point is that this was happening all over during the late 80s and early 90s.
It was. And so my husband and I were young parents, children the same age, and we started reading about this case when it exploded into the newspapers, and we were just baffled by it, that people believed that the things that the children were saying, that they could possibly be true. And we kept going back to this idea that this young 18-year-old girl, all she had to do was tell them what they wanted to hear, and she could go home she could be with her baby. She could be free of the charges. And she refused. All of them refused. And in fact, in 35 years, not one of them has ever turned on the others or said anything happened or done anything except deny it, just completely and relentlessly denied that anything ever happened. And my husband said in those early years, somebody needs to write this book. I wish you'd write the book. And I'm like, I don't have time to write this book. I'm
right. Yeah.
I'm a young mother, and he just kept pressuring me every time we would read something about it. He said, I wish you'd write this book. And then I began teaching at 42. I was a late bloomer. And he was still pushing me, write this book, write this book, write this book. And then I retired and COVID hit, and it was like, and then I had this absolutely happenstance meeting with Robin just out of nowhere. And Joe and I were the only ones still talking about it. It had gone silent. The story had gone silent.
And Robin was one of the accused.
Robin was the youngest of the 7 defendants. And I happened to meet her. And I don't want to say too much about how I meet her, because that's the first chapter in my book.
Yeah, got to read it.
Yeah. But I through tears, I just looked at her and I said, "Can I write your book?" And she said, "I'm ready."
So it was it, did you take that, like, finally, and kind of, like you said, by happenstance, meeting this person who you've kind of followed from afar, her story for so long, did you just take that as a sign? I mean, your husband's been in your ear for years telling you to write the book, and you put it off, like a lot of us do that have stories here and here in our heads and hearts that we want to share. Was that enough, you meeting her, being like, okay, this is a sign the world is sending me?
It was. I couldn't deny it. I mean, just from the very minute we were introduced, I could not deny that this was it was my moment in the universe to make this wrong a right. And I knew I had the skills to do it. I knew I had the research skills to do it, though I didn't really start into it thinking that I was going to research. I started into it. I had her go home and sit down with a yellow legal pad. I finally had to teach her to use Google Docs so that I could copy and
Right, right,
paste.
right. So
And
you
I
can
had her
comment and ask questions.
yeah, I had her go home. I gave her some sort of beginning questions, things I wanted her to think about, but she just went home and wrote. And the
Yeah.
minute she started writing, it started pouring out of her. The floodgates opened, and she wrote for hours and hours and hours and sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. And, we would spend hours on the phone. And so as I'm taking her notes and translating them into what I think is a reasonable narrative,
Mhm.
a readable narrative, I kept going, gosh, how did that happen? How did I not know about that? And so that's when the research end came into it.
Yeah.
And the more I researched and the more I dug into the things that she was writing about, the more disturbing this case became to me. And the more I realized that it was much bigger than just Robin Bowles Byram Kudo. It was a, a total miscarriage of justice. It
Mhm.
was prosecutors who were so driven to prove their story that they actually created their own narrative. And all the evidence was there that proved that. And it still disturbs me. I go back and I keep rereading my book before every book event, and I get mad all over again. But it's an important part of my storytelling is to have
Yeah.
that
You're
energy and that momentum going.
absolutely, you're totally connected to it, and it's a real purpose, and that's why I was excited to have you on, because it's not just like you had this dream of like, I finally retired. I've always wanted to write a book. Maybe I should write a book. Like, this was a calling.
Yeah.
This was and that's why you're so attached to it. And it is this mission. And I want to dive into every stage of this mission. I do have one quick question. When you met her, she's been carrying this with her for a long time. And I would already believe this, but I know from reading your book, which is called 21 Boxes, by the way, for anyone listening, um, I would imagine she would be wanting to suppress the story and move on, right? To like not open Pandora's box, so to speak. And so that's a big leap, and that's opening up and being as vulnerable as possible. When you asked her that upon that happenstance meeting and said, "Oh my gosh, can I write your book?" What was her initial reaction? Did she feel that kismet connection with you already, or did she have to sleep on it? Like, how did she respond to that?
She she has very deep faith, and
Mm,
she will tell people when we talk that is what saved her through a lot of this story. Um, and she just knew. She knew she wanted to tell the story, but she also wanted to hide from it. And
yeah.
she had been hiding from it. She
Hmm.
had buried all those documents and all those letters and all that information in her attic and had never touched it in 35 years.
Mm,
And but when she made the decision, there was a connection. There was
yeah.
something between us that she felt it and I felt it. And I'm not a very religious person, but I certainly believe that, whatever that powerful connection was between us, it was meant to happen. And in fact, when I was teaching the Crucible, I was absolutely obsessed with teaching it. I loved it. I taught it passionately. I taught it every semester, every year, never tired of it. And in fact, believed in it so much that my students would take these big international exams at the end of the year. And it was the one that they always wrote about. Oh, almost without exception, every student wrote about it because the experience was so intense. And I don't know if you're familiar, you probably are, with The Crucible, but John Proctor
Hmm.
is he's the central character, and he's the one in the end. They finally, he knows he's going to be hanged, and they force him to sign a confession, and then he rips the confession up and says, I can't sign this. And he rips it to shreds. And he said, how can I sign my name to a lie? I can't do it. And I would teach this story. We would read it aloud. We all had parts. Everybody was fighting over the parts. And And then I would use Robin from the Little Rascals Daycare case as my John Proctor,
Wow.
because she always, always refused to give them a lie. She wouldn't do it. As did, like I say, as did the rest of them. She was not the only hero, but she is by far the most heroic person I've ever known in my life, ever.
Hmm. I love what you said about her. Like, she was a little hesitant, but she kind of needed to tell it. And I think a lot of us that have any kind of traumatic event go through that, which is why when you described her going down and finally writing it, it just came pouring out along with all the tears in her body. She needed to. So I think what a great connection. And how cool is it that your story with the Crucible has come so full circle? I mean, that's bizarre. It is, but it's not, right? Like, life works out like that a lot of the times if you allow it to.
Yeah.
Like, the way it ties things together is just is beautiful. I want to get to a little bit of the actual practical execution of this. You already alluded to the research, which is definitely one of the questions that I wanted to get to, because my goodness, it was a lot. Now, I love, and I told you this when we talked before, I love how you wove Robin's story and let her write her story in with the kind of facts of what was going on with the case. It was a beautiful ebb and flow and gave great rhythm to the narrative. But on your parts, it was so dense, so much research had to go into this.
It did.
And this is your labor of love.
Mm.
I mean, you self-published this, right?
I did.
So, you didn't necessarily have an advance or anything behind you, but just the will, right? The discipline, the mission, the purpose, and the will. Just talk to me. I don't even have a direct question. I just want to hear a little bit more about your process of how you tackle that much research and seeing the things you found, like the 21 boxes, for example. Like, you're working your butt off there. That's a huge mountain to climb. Now, for anybody listening that has a true story that they're trying to tell, heck, myself included, how do you approach that so it doesn't seem so daunting that you just give up?
Mm. Well, one, I love research. So
That's good. That's a good
I do.
start, right? You've got the background in it.
Yeah, and my students hated me for it because I was very insistent that they do it the right way. But um, what happened was, initially what I had was Robin's story. I had her notes, and I drafted out, and I wasn't really even sure where the chapters were going to be or how. I'm just rewriting it and putting it into a narrative for her, a narrative that to me sounds readable. And then I got, and she wanted more in it and more in it because she had a story to tell and she wanted
Yeah.
it all out there. She was ready and she wanted everything in there. And I kept saying, well, I'm not sure, maybe we want to cut this. Maybe we don't want to go that far. Is this really what people want to read?
Hmm.
And then that just something inside of me saying that if what I did was write her story, just write her memoir, it was going to be her word against theirs. And that had been the problem from the very beginning, is that the defendants, the Edenton Seven, which is what they came to be called, they're all saying nothing happened. Nobody saw anything. There's no physical evidence. There's no eyewitness ever. But the prosecution and the therapists kept saying, well, we know something happened. We know something happened. And I still have people say, well, what do you say to somebody who says, we know something happened? No, you don't. You think it happened. That doesn't make it fact. Anyway, so I'm looking at this book, and I finally had to say to her one day, and I had at that point, I'd handle it very carefully because she's raw. I mean, her
Yeah.
emotions are hanging out on the laundry at this point.
Hmm.
And I had to convince her that if we really wanted people to take this book seriously, and that it not be just her family and her girlfriends that buy the book, that was not going to get her story out there, that we needed to prove that it was a lie. And so I started with little pieces of information, right? And there's a man, his name is Lou Powell. He's a retired newspaper reporter in Charlotte. He was following this story at the same time my husband and I were,
Mhm.
and he was just as disturbed by the troubling contradictions. And he started, collecting things he read in the paper. He's gathering all this information. And then when when Bob Kelly's case is finally overturned on appeal, his attorneys, when it's all done, his attorney gave Lou Powell, because he had followed it so closely and he even set up a website, gave him all that information, all those legal documents, all those letters, all those motions, all the transcripts, everything. And he donated them to Duke University Law Library, which is where the 21 boxes comes from. And he, 24,000 pages of documents. And I finally, after doing all my research online and all this discovery and talking, I interviewed.
Yeah.
So I interviewed, obviously, Robin. I interviewed Betsy Kelly, Bob Kelly.
Real quick, what was the method of interviewing? Did you go to them in person? Was it phone calls?
Some of them, and some were on phone calls, and a few were via email, particularly the lawyers, because like the appellate lawyer, he was involved in appeals and he didn't have time.
Sure.
So I would just send him questions and he would respond back. Desmond Runyon from UNC Chapel Hill. Ours was a couple of phone calls and then a whole lot of emails and him answering questions. So it was really I just had to be persistent and relentless and a pest. And I was a pest. Anyway, so I'm going through, and as she's telling this story, I'm trying to find facts to back up what she's saying, because as I said, her story was not going to have the impact if I didn't prove it for her. I needed to prove her innocence, and I was obsessed. There's just no question about it. I would sit up. Sometimes I'd start writing it, 3:00 in the afternoon. The next day at 11 o'clock, I'd realize I'm still writing. I hadn't eaten. I was still in my pajamas. I hadn't slept, because it was just this. I was driven by it, like nothing I've ever done in my life. I just knew that was why that meeting happened. That's why I met her, and that I had to do this for her. And not just for her. I think that now they all realize, that all 7 of them, I hope they do. I know most of them do, understand that they will benefit from this. And my goal, all of this was paid for out of my pocket. I may one day get reimbursed, but if I never get a penny of it back, I don't care. My sole goal for this, other than getting Robin's story out there for her, is to insist to the state of North Carolina that they issue a statement of innocence to these 7 people, because they were wrongly prosecuted, wrongly adjudicated, wrongly imprisoned. And it's time, 35 years later, it's time for a politician in North Carolina to have the courage to say, we screwed up and we're sorry.
Yeah. How long did it take from that initial meeting to getting the green light effectively from Robin? Like, yes, we're going to do this. Yeah, but how long did it take from that point of like, okay, I'm going forward with this, to having the book in your hand?
Okay. I think she read several drafts, and I think it was, I think I was halfway through with the book before she finally at peace with me adding the other stuff in there, because she wanted, her vision for it in the beginning was that it was going to be her memoir. And like I said, I had to convince her that we had a bigger picture for this. And in order to accomplish it, it had to be more than that.
What's interesting is you're both right, and you both needed each other, because in my opinion, and I mean, this is storytelling 101, you tell a micro story so that the audience can fall in love and root for a character. A micro story with macro universal themes, right? Talking about a bigger picture, a bigger topic with a bigger message, but you have to do it through the lens of a smaller story so that we can follow it. If we'd have just written a book about the huge case, it would have been almost like an educational book. It would have been like a textbook, and that's not going to catch people's attention unless they're really looking specifically for that. And on the flip side, if Robin just wrote a memoir, you've already kind of said this yourself, it would be just her story, her word against someone else's. And often memoirs it's sad to say, but so many people go through so many traumatic things. It's very easy for a personal memoir to get lost
Yeah,
in the haystack, right? There's just so much out there, people wanting to get their personal stories across. So it's a beautiful marriage. And I think it took both sides,
I do too.
because just the research might be a little too dense for people without the singular narrative. And just the singular narrative, as you said, wouldn't have the backup that kind of showed the bigger picture of what was going on, because that context is super important. Even the really far zoomed out context of what was going on across the country is
Right,
super important,
right.
because Edenton, God love him, got swept up in the hysteria,
They did.
right? The issue is, and I know I don't need to convince you of this, is digging our heels in for decades now and not just saying like, you're right.
Never facing it.
Yeah, that accountability is
Yeah.
nowhere to be found.
And this is what I run into with the people from Edenton is on both sides, because there were a lot of people who from Edenton and Chowan County who didn't believe it, who recognized it for what it was. But even those folks didn't know the facts. And
Right.
that's been something that I've heard back from them over and over again is I had no idea. I had no idea. And recently I've had I call them Edentonites, come to me, people who grew up there, people who are closer to my age, who would have had young children at the time. And they have said, I have always believed it happened. And they were just emotional. One lady was crying when she said, "Thank you, because I always thought this was true, and now you have convinced me that it was a witch hunt." And Robin's narrative wouldn't have done that alone, because it still would have been the people who believed her. They knew her story, right? So it's I saw it as an essential component in putting the book out and putting the book together. So
Did you personally face pushback in trying to get this story told?
yes.
Tell me
Yeah.
about that.
Well, one thing is the children, adults now,
Yeah.
didn't want to talk to me. I finally got 3. Um, I had a few who have, through other people, made it clear that they know they're 39, 40 years old,
Yeah.
maybe 41. Most of them are 39 and 40. They know that it didn't happen. They know they were manipulated and traumatized by these interrogation sessions, but they can't say it out of respect for their parents, because the parents still believe it. And if you think about it, what they put their children through is just unbelievable to me. Unbelievable. And I, I wrote the book and I still can't believe it. And for them to admit now, 35 years later, to their children, well, gosh, maybe we
Yeah,
were
they
wrong.
wouldn't do it. They
No,
wouldn't
it's
do it.
not going to happen.
It's so unfair to the children too. I mean, they didn't even have a say so really. They're 3. I gotta say, the whole time I'm reading this and the far-fetched, absurd statements that were eventually pulled from the kids, it wasn't offered up initially. It was after many, many interrogations. Then finally they started talking about, I don't need to go into details. Folks read the book, but like just insane things like I'm getting eaten by sharks in the river, that sort of stuff. I have a 3-year-old right now.
Mhm.
I know what it's like to carry on a conversation with him. It I mean, I'm being real, it's impossible, right? I mean, now he's finally starting to be able to articulate what thoughts are in his head, but it's still most of the time just absurdity and you're trying to make sense of something. So I was thinking about that the whole time. Like, imagine trying to interrogate or interview a 2.5, 3-year-old and hoping to take away factual information.
Hours often.
I mean,
Yeah.
I could seriously, and any parent that has a 3-year-old or a 2.5-year-old, like they're probably chuckling too. It's not a funny matter, but it's absurd,
Yeah.
is what it is, to think that you could do that. And eventually, they'll just start saying anything.
Yeah. I'll tell this one story
Okay.
just for the benefit of the listeners. There's a little boy. He was 3 when the case broke, and he on the witness stand, the defense attorney said, "Well, what did you do?" And he said, and it's this sort of universal theme that comes up in all the interviews with the therapist about a boat, right? Some of the children claimed they were taken out on tugboats, on steamboats, on canoes, on motorboats, on whatever. But it shows up in all the interviews, and as people read the book, they'll understand sort of the pattern that happens. But anyway, the little boy, when they're questioning him on the witness stand, he says, "Well, what did you do?" And he said, "Well, Mr. Bob took us out on the boat." "Well, who is us?" "Well," and there was a little girl. So it was just the two of them. And they're both 3 years old. And they get out. He takes them out into the middle of the Albemarle Sound. Little boy doesn't know the name of the water. He calls it the river.
Mhm.
And then he said, "Well, what happened next?" And he said, "Well, Mr. Bob threw her in the water and there were sharks swimming everywhere." And he said, "Well, oh my gosh, well, that's horrible. Well, what did you do?" He said, "I jumped in and saved her." And he supposedly, in the words of a 3-year-old, saved the little girl, swam back to the boat. And then the defense attorney says, "Well, then what did you do?" And he said, "Well, we got on the boat. And then what did you do?" "Well, we took the boat back. And I helped Mr. Bob pull the boat out of the water. And then we went back to school." It's like,
I
okay,
don't, I
you
can't
can see
really,
a 3-year-old telling that story, right?
I can't, I have not been able to grasp adults talking to children, getting that type of response and being like, "Oh, okay, let's take this further." I mean, I'm at a loss. Like, and it's not funny because these are real people's lives. This is a real story that happened,
Yeah.
but the absurd is the only word I can keep coming back to. I mean, I'm so proud of you
Thank you.
for doing this, because you are climbing up your own mountain
Mm,
here, and because it is such a wild journey, but it is a story that does not need to be swept under the rug, and it's been way too long.
mm,
Getting back to the actual execution of making this a thing. This is what I want a lot of people to hear, is that yes, you had this idea. Yes, this is this unjust event that happened that's been smothered, and you're doing all this research, but it's still a lot of work to turn something into a physical book.
it is.
So once you had it and Robin understood you needed to add the research and all of that, and you had your completed draft, how easy or how challenging was it for you to get that into a book? I know it's easier now than it ever has been for people to self-publish books, but it's still not easy,
Yeah.
right? It's easier than it was 30 years ago, but it's not
I
easy.
cried a lot.
You cried a lot. Tell me about that journey for you as a self-published author with this mission to get this story out to the world.
Well, the first thing I did is I just started researching and talking to people who had published books, and said, "How did you do it? What'd you do?" I had to find out what the pathway was. So I reached out to UNC Chapel Hill first, because UNC Chapel Hill was closely involved in this case,
Mm,
and they responded back and said, "Well, thank you for your inquiry. I'll take it to the board and we'll consider it. It takes about 4 to 6 weeks for us to respond to you." They responded to me in 48 hours and said, "Way, no, thank you. We are not even remotely interested in this." Yeah. And then I thought, okay, do I send my manuscript to a big, who am I? I've never been published. I'm nobody. I don't have a name. I don't have, you know, so I thought, do I send it to these big publishing houses? So I started doing some emailing and calling, and they all said basically the same thing. It takes about 2 years, and you may never hear back. If they don't pick it up, you may never hear back. And I'm thinking, Robin's tribe, her family, her village that stood behind her, they're elderly now. Her mother has already died, and
mm,
and there's no hope for her to see Robin's exoneration. And I thought, if I do this, people are dying now. It's been 35 years,
yeah.
and this people who need to read this book are not going to hear it. The judges are already dead. Some of the attorneys are dead. It's just I needed it to get out there.
Yeah.
So I went around, and the interesting thing that put me on the pathway to publishing this was I went into the local bookstore here in Little Washington, and the owner at the time, it's a new owner now, the owner at the time said, all I can tell you is this. I keep getting this phone call, sorry. um, uh, he said, you can't, no, the independent bookstores what's your target? And I said, I want it to be where people can walk in locally and buy this book. And he said, well, we're not going to touch you if you go through someplace like Amazon, one of the big,
Right.
tech platforms. And I said, well, I don't want to do that. And at this point, I had hired an editor. I had hired a copy editor. I had hired a graphic design person. I had put out all this money, and I'm thinking, I need to make this happen. And he put me onto IngramSpark.
There you go.
Yes, it's okay for me to say that, right?
Totally. Yeah. That's
Great publishing opportunity. I had to do it. I had to do my own legwork. I could do it through them. They had names and connections and things like that. But I had already done my homework and done my research. So I'd hired the people that I needed to help me finish the book and polish it. And I had to learn how to use IngramSpark, which was interesting for somebody 70 years old.
And also, all loved IngramSpark, but their website's a little dated. Just it's not, But
and it's also about the money, because every time you turn around, they're sending you an email saying, well, if you do this, then
so they are helpful. And for those listening that aren't familiar with IngramSpark, that's who you would want to create an account with if you want a bookstore to buy copies of your book to have for sale. That's what you have to have. Now, if you self-publish, you can self-publish only on Amazon. That's certainly another route. It's fairly easy. But if you want it to be even in a big store like Barnes & Noble, if you want it to be in local stores like Pamlico Books, shout out to Tom, the former owner. I know him as well. IngramSpark is where you have to go, and they'll walk you through how to format it and all of that. Now, the point
they even teach you how to do the barcodes and
absolutely
do the ISBN numbers and all this. I learned so much in the process of doing this. It was
absolutely
astounding.
Well, that's why I want people to hear your story, not just Robin's story, but your story as an author, because you're doing all the right things and it's starting to take off in a grassroots manner. And this can happen to self-published books, but we're going to get to it in a second. It takes a few things. But yeah, there's so many steps. And you mentioned that you had to hire an editor, you had to hire a copy editor. What's the difference between the two? People need to think about all of these things. You had to hire a graphic designer. You had to work with IngramSpark on where to put how to get the IBSN number. I always get the acronym mixed up. The barcode, where to put it on the cover, because if it's not in the right spot, there's so many details that have to be done. If the title on the spine is not aligned properly, then it's not going to work, etc.
The hardest part for us, we couldn't get it to line up.
Because you're talking about millimeters. You're talking about millimeters of difference. I've been through this process too. But the reason why it was such the right choice for you, which you've already said, is speed. So if you have one story that you want to tell, and you want to take your shot at the big publisher, sure, go for it. But that's what you're going to sacrifice is, well, two things: control and time and speed. So if you want it to be out quickly for a reason like you had, which is very, very fair, to a reason to want it to be out, then self-publishing is the way to go. But the other thing that you need to know as a self-publisher, I'm sorry, I'm speaking to everybody else now, is that you are going to have to do all the legwork. Now, the reason I chose to with my first book was because I know most of my audience, so I can speak directly to them. If I went with a big or medium-sized publisher, they're still going to have to leverage my network to get it out there, because I'm not like a celebrity or something like that already has it. So if I was going to do most of the marketing, I figured I'll do it myself anyway. So the other thing that you need is someone who can champion the book, and most likely it's going to be the author, which in this case is you. So let's talk a little bit about that. Now, I know from talking to you personally that you're having all these book signings across the states, very grassroots. You're making your own, book tour, basically. You're having meetings. I know that you've sent it to the governor's office. I don't want to say too much of your story. I want you to tell us. But that is a whole nother part, a whole nother journey within the overall journey of getting this story out there, is getting it to people that will read it, telling them about it. How in the world are you handling that? It doesn't seem like you've been able to take your foot off the pedal.
We have. It's been overwhelming. I will not take full credit for marketing the book, because Robin has worked very hard. She has reached out to everyone she knows, but her only avenue was either to talk to them personally or Facebook. And she has done a champion's job. As soon as we published the end of March, we were plastering on our social media pages. My husband is not only my muse, but my biggest champion. And he has books in his hands all the time. And he's out there putting it in the hands of people in the judicial system. So he's calling me all the time saying, well, I've talked to so-and-so and he wants you to send a book, or she wants you to send a book. And it's nonstop. It means that every day we hit the ground running, and we are sending emails and taking phone calls and planning events. Now we published the end of March. This is how many months later? 7 months later.
Yeah.
And people are reaching out to us now and saying, I'd like to help you have an event. And that means that we've crossed over a bridge, I think. We did an event in Greenville at Barnes & Noble that the people were lined up out the door.
Oh
And the manager said that he had been there 2 years and he had never experienced a book signing event like that. But this is Eastern North Carolina, right? We've tried to build a cocoon around Edenton because they don't want us there. They still want to, somebody from Edenton posted a review and said, let sleeping dogs lie. Well, for you.
That is wild. Like, that's the review. Like, let's just not talk about it. Okay.
Yeah. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? Just to get rich? And I'm thinking, you just have no idea. But they want us to stay silent because it's convenient for them. But what about Robin and Bob?
Well, that's not even a criticism or critique of the book. No, like, that you're showing your true color. Here's what happens with trolls like that. Like, they tell on themselves so quickly. Is like the fact that you didn't say like this book is false. Yeah. Your statement was let sleeping dogs lie. That you're already exposing yourself.
Yeah, somebody said to me, you got under their skin. I said, yes, I did.
Yeah.
And I'm also kind of a pit bull. I don't shy away from crowds. I don't shy away from conflict and controversy. And so this was right up my alley to go right in there and just keep digging and digging and pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. And my students would probably come online and say, man, she sure is. But it's mine to just keep pushing, and it has worked, but it's exhausting. It is. But the things that have happened because of it, like the first real book event I did, other than just something right here locally, I went to the Pirate Fest at Bath, and this man walks up to me, and this is how it's like a spider web that just keeps growing and growing. This man walks up to me and he said, he just came up and looked at the book, stood there for about 10 seconds, didn't look me in the face, walked away. And everybody keeps saying, Betsy, you really need to hire a bodyguard or, off-duty police officer or somebody, because somebody's going to come after you. And I'm like, nah, I'm not going to do that. But that moment I thought, ooh, maybe I should have. So he walks away, he comes back in just a couple of minutes, and he stands there longer, and he still doesn't look me in the face. And then just as he's getting ready to walk off, he kind of glances up at me, never says a word, walks away, comes back again in a few minutes, picks up the book, stands and looks at the book for a few minutes, then looks up at me and he said, you the author? And I'm thinking, I don't know. Yeah, I guess so. I said, yes, I am. And he said, are you familiar with the litigation case, with the civil case in this trial? And I said, I am. I said, are you talking about the litigation with the insurance policy? He said, I am. And I said, yes, I do know about it. And I said, in fact, I write about it in the book. And he said, well, let me just tell you, let me put a little, side note in here. The 42 of the parents signed on to a lawsuit suing the insurance company in June. Bob Kelly was never arraigned. He was arrested in April, charged with 100 counts of sexual crimes against little children. The first week in June, 42 parents signed this lawsuit. No, I'm sorry. It was 22 parents. It was 42 children, because some of the families had more than one child involved in it. Signed a lawsuit against the insurance company and got $1 million settlement. That's one of the things I discovered in my research. And I write about it in the book, that here they're not 2 months into the case. They're barely a month, just over a month into the case, and they're getting $1 million settlement from the insurance company. And he said, well, it was always just about the money. He said at that point, they could have cared less about whether this case ever went to trial. And he said, no, first he says, I was the litigator in that case, the chief litigator for Farm Bureau Insurance. And I said, oh my gosh. And then he tells me that they got this big settlement. And I said, well, I knew about the settlement. And he said, yeah, it was just about the money. Now, imagine being Robin and finding that out. Or Bob Kelly, or Betsy Kelly, or Shelley, or any of them, finding out 35 years later. 35 years later, they didn't know about the settlement. And here they find out that these kids, and when they turned 18, they all got their money out of a trust fund, and they were out buying brand new pickup trucks. $20,000 to an 18-year-old in 1990 was a lot of money. A lot of money. Yeah. Money. Money drives a lot of things. Anyway, now I don't remember what the question was.
No. I'm glad you took us on that journey. I'm curious. You mentioned about your students when you were talking about how you you don't take any crap. Have any of them reached out to you or know that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
What do they
In
say?
fact, one of them, it turns out, is best friends with Betsy and Bob Kelly's daughter, and
That's crazy.
she was so grateful that I had written the book. A lot of my students, I mean, dozens and dozens of my students have already read the book, and some of them have been to book signings. I look up at every book signing, and there's 3 or 4 or 5 of
That's
them
awesome.
sitting in the audience, which is pretty cool. So, yeah.
What's some of the, you talked about at Greenville, the line was kind of around long line waiting for the book signing. And now I know you've had several of them. What are some of the common pieces of feedback from those folks that attend the book signings?
Well, obviously gratitude for telling the story. And I don't think I've talked to anybody who read it and said, "Oh yeah, I figured that's what happened." Nobody. Some people believed it right up until they read the book.
Wow.
I've had a half a dozen, and some of them were mothers of students I taught who grew up in Edenton and had always believed the story, had always believed it, and have come back to me and said with deep gratitude, thank you for helping them understand what happened and what didn't happen. I went to have a facial the other day, and a lady walked in, and I get a massage there and a facial, and a lady walks in, and the girl that does the massage said, "Oh, this is the lady I was talking about." And she said, "Who? What?" And she said, "The lady that wrote the book." And she just turned around to me, and she had tears in her eyes, and she said, "Oh my goodness." She said, "I have lived in Chowan County all my life." And she had to be at least my age. She said, "I have always believed that was true, that they did it." And she said, "And now I see. Now I see. It can't be denied. Facts don't lie."
If tomorrow someone from the state of North Carolina did what you said your sole goal was, which is to exonerate them to some extent, to admit that these people were innocent, and that happened tomorrow, would you stop? Are you done? You've reached that goal, or has the goal shifted since you've started this now?
Well, that ultimate goal has never shifted. That's what I want. And Josh Stein told me he has read it.
Oh yeah.
And I also gave it to his wife and his daughter. I hope they've read it. Jeff Jackson has assured me that he's read it. Allison Riggs, who is running for Supreme Court, has it and said she was going home and reading it the weekend I gave it to her. Kristen and Roy Cooper have that book in their hands, and I believe Kristen has read it. I hope Cook has. I taught their daughter. I would hope that they would read it. And my thoughts about it at this point, I know it's a political hot button, because in this climate, in this world, in 2021, 2024, people are going to be out there saying, "Oh yeah, I won't vote for him because he said those pedophiles didn't do it." And I know they did, I can hear that. But Roy Cooper has nothing to lose by issuing that statement of innocence now. He's, once the election's over, he's going out, and he could do it, and it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. Any one of them can do it. Well, not Allison Riggs, but any one of the Jeff Jackson, if he wins the attorney general's seat, if Josh Stein
Right.
wins the governor's, they can all do it. Right there in that little window, they can do it, and they will have 4 years to justify that decision. And I will be glad to talk to anybody they want me to talk to. But it is so much bigger than Edenton, North Carolina, because
Absolutely.
there were so many of them. And there are still people sitting in prison today from those original 200 cases that have never been freed. Their cases have never been overturned on appeal. That says a lot. And we're in a climate, this. We're in a climate where contagion and hysteria and conspiracies abound.
Mm.
And people believe things just because, or that confirms their bias. And we're going to have to do this about a whole lot of things, I think, in the future. But conspiracies are, they are what they are. They're based on lies and fear, and they feed off of themselves and feed off of each other, and they spread like wildfire, and they're hard to stop. And look how long it took to stop the one about Robin and the Edenton Seven. I mean, 35 years is a long time. It's a long time. She went from being a teenager to being a grandmother. I went from being barely, I was a young woman, and I'm now, I'm in my golden years, and we're still fighting this battle. And I just go, how did this not happen before now?
Seriously.
How did it not happen? It just took somebody to tell the story, and they've all had 35 years to write their story. So they're mad at me, but they had a chance to write their books and prove their case, but they didn't, because that wasn't what it was about.
There's one line, Anne Lamott from Bird by Bird.
Uh-huh.
I won't try to look it up right now, but I'll paraphrase the gist of it. There's a quote from her that I love, that it's like, no, basically you have the right to tell any story that happened to you, and if people don't like it, then they should have behaved better.
Yeah, that's right.
It's something, that's it. She worded it better than I did, but that's, because you deal with that a lot. I've dealt with that myself, about telling true stories that have happened to me in my life, and lots of people do, and other people get upset.
Mm-hmm.
And I just love that line. It's like, that's what she said. You own any story, anything that happened to you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's totally available for you to tell that story. Now, last question before we go, and I won't ask you to speak for Robin, of course, but I know that she also had wanted to get this out of her head and out of her heart so that she could begin to heal from this. And now you two have been on this 7-month journey since you published it, and it's gaining ground. It's great, gaining traction, and things seem to be working. Of course, you're going to have to keep that foot on the pedal. What is your sense, or what has she told you directly about how she's processing all of this?
Yeah. Well, I hope we can get her on, because her version is fascinating, and
Right.
it's been a different experience for her, obviously, because she lived it. But she was so nervous in the beginning. She was so afraid for people to know who she was. I mean, imagine having to put your children in daycare and being afraid that somebody would identify you because your picture was in the paper. So it's been an evolution for her. It's been her journey is learning to be okay with her story being out there.
Right.
And I think, and it's really, it's so nice to see her, how she's blossomed in these book events to gain more and more confidence, and in her being able to tell her story. So the ones we're doing 2 in Elizabeth City tomorrow and Friday, and she's a lot of these are her people, it's her.
Right. I was about to say you're getting close.
Yeah, we're getting close, and we built this cocoon around Edenton. I say that they can only shut us out so much. But anyway, there's a lot of Edenton folks that are going, and we've had a lot of people sneak into the bookstores and buy the book, and then somebody will say, the person will say, "Well, are you going to go to the talk?" And she'll, "Oh heavens, no, no!" Of course, they're not going to be seen publicly. But anyway, this will be the first one where she really carries the torch for the book event, because they're there to see her and hear her, and she's gutsy. I mean, she has to be gutsy.
Gotta be.
She's got a lot of guts to be able to live through what she's done and built a very, very, very wonderful life. She has a loving husband and 2 wonderful sons and grandchildren and daughters-in-law who love her, which is not always the case. And I mean, she's a precious, authentic human being, and you just fall in love with her. I know you will. So
I just got goosebumps. I just got chills just thinking about this story of
yeah.
redemption, if you will, and it's so powerful. So I'm very proud of both of you all for doing this, because I know how hard it is, and it's harder than anything that I've done on both accounts. So if there's anything that I can do in the future to help, I'm here. Super, super proud of you. For anyone listening, it's 21 boxes, and the fire is catching. There it goes right there. I'll put the link in the show notes. Betsy, thank you so much for spending
Thank
time with me.